Hey, thanks so much for tuning in to today's Drawing for Adults class. This class is offered as a partnership between the Ann Arbor District Library and the Ann Arbor Art Center, both located downtown Ann Arbor. Today we're going to be creating compelling compositions with mixed media. So whatever materials that you have at home, we will hopefully be using a variety today, but you can definitely think a little bit abstractly, and I'll mention some different ideas to you. I'll be using primarily what will look kind of like watercolor, as well as some charcoal. Maybe graphite would also be a good substitute, along with some other materials that hopefully you may have on hand. So I'm going to be showing you two different compositions today, while also talking a little bit more about just the general idea of how to create a composition and so forth. So if you're not familiar with the term composition, a composition refers to the arrangement of visual elements in a work of art. So it's the process of deciding how and where each part should be placed so that the piece of art will look like a unified whole. So there's lots of different ways of creating a composition, but one of the most important things that we need to really consider are the visual elements that I mentioned there. So what does that mean? What are visual elements? I think of elements, I often think of the chemistry, the periodic table of elements. Well, it's a little different with art. So there's these things called the elements of art, along with principles of design. So our elements of art, there's 7 of them: line, shape, form, color, value, texture, and space. And so these are all really important to incorporate into a work of art. That doesn't mean that you have to necessarily include all of these elements of art in one particular work, but it's good to at least consider how are you using them, or even how are you not using them. And then the other thing is the principles of art. So the principles of art are a little bit more complex. So the first two here, we have pattern and rhythm, and I think that these two things really go together. I see movement is kind of in that category as well, but rhythm is kind of similar to pattern. I always think of a pattern that's dancing as a way to describe rhythm. So those can be that, the use of something that's being repeated is really important. Oftentimes we want to have, in a work of art, we want to have things in odd numbers. So rather than having 2 people in a figure drawing, for example, having a third person can really balance it out, because we naturally just want to kind of categorize. We want to separate, we want to make things in even little piles, if you will. And so if we have an odd number, the brain can't necessarily separate them very easily. And so that is one way that we can incorporate pattern/rhythm in a composition. So proportion and scale is another one. So having things in accurate proportion that's in scale or to scale is really important as well. Or it could even be that things are intentionally out of proportion, or it's not to scale. And there's definitely something to that as well that can be very interesting. But if you're having, let's say, a landscape or a cityscape or something, and you're looking down a street, well, the building should be getting smaller and smaller and smaller the further they get away from the foreground right there at the bottom of your page. So that's really important if you want to give a sense of like an accurate perspective. So balance might be arguably the most important one of the principles of art to consider when thinking about composition. And that's simply because if your piece as a whole doesn't really have a good sense of balance, then you're going to lose the viewer's interest really fast. It's going to feel somewhat uncomfortable even. And so there's a couple different ways that we can create this balance. It doesn't mean that we have to have it be symmetrical on both sides or have radial symmetry or anything like that. In fact, oftentimes having an asymmetrical balance where it's a little bit heavier on one side can be beneficial to a work work of art. We also have this thing called the rule of thirds. So imagine a grid that's splitting your frame into thirds, both vertically and horizontally. You would just want to place the subject matter kind of along those lines. And so the intersections of those lines would be especially interesting places to position your subject matter. So that's another way that we can use balance when creating a composition. And then unity is really similar to balance. Unity is, how are you unifying your work of art? Is it through color? So kind of looking back at those elements of art, is it some kind of, leading lines that connect all of the different parts of your composition together? So I've got these trees in the foreground that kind of lead to the trees in the background that lead to the sky. And then we have emphasis. So emphasis is, when we're focusing on one particular part of your overall work of art. And so that doesn't mean that you only would have one real focus point, but it's also just that the other parts in your composition are there to support that leading role of the, whatever is the main part of your work of art that you are trying to create. So thinking about how you can really create emphasis. Is it with contrast? Is it with value? Is it with texture? All of those things can help create emphasis. So hopefully this is helpful in thinking about how we use the elements of art and principles to create a nice, well-balanced, intriguing composition. So we're going to go ahead and move on to the creating part of the process here. Like I said before, I will be using watercolor to start. I'm going to be creating 2 different compositions for you. So here I am now just laying down some watercolor paint that in kind of just no particular specific order or anything. I'm just playing with the paints. Now, you'll have to bear with me as I'm doing this because I'm doing it digitally. There's going to be a lot of things that are a little bit confusing, I'll have to admit, in this and that. I'm kind of going forwards and backwards and cutting and pasting and all of that, so it's a little confusing. So I apologize for any confusion you may have, but hopefully I'll make it kind of clear. But it's part of the process of doing this virtually instead of in person. So anyway, so I'm going to basically end up going back and sort of doing something that I would have initially actually put underneath the watercolor, which is adding in newspaper. So if you have newspapers or some kind of paper, not something that's glossy, that won't work very well. That's a really fun thing that you can just use a glue stick and glue it onto your paper before you get started. I didn't do that here initially before I started painting, so you're going to see later that I go back and I add that in, but at least here you can see really clearly the application of the paint, the way I'm kind of blending and softening up those edges, adding some nice contrasting colors in here, but also making it so that there's this nice balance between warm and cool colors that are really pulling across the whole page. So normally with watercolors, we don't really use white very often, but this is one of those cases where let's just break the rules a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and create another composition here using a different set of colors, but in a very similar way. All right, so now I'm going to go back to that first one that I did, and I'm going to do that newspaper thing I was talking about, where I'm going to sort of change up the order in which I'm doing things and place that newspaper underneath what I would have painted on top. And again, just to make things just a little bit more complicated here, I am going to be showing you a drawing that I'm going to be doing separately on a white background so that you can see it very clearly. This is with ink. So this would be using just some kind of ink pen if you have this around your home, and it's creating a portrait using nothing but scribbles. So you don't have to do this. This is just a way for me to incorporate another media, another element into my design here. So this is really focusing a lot on line, and I'm just going to be putting this essentially on top of my design that I have. So I'm focusing on just the upper half of the face. I'm not including the mouth, and you'll see why in a moment. But you can practice this as like a whole other little mini lesson within this larger lesson here, so you can follow along if you'd like, but you can also just think of something else you want to draw with ink pens. You don't have to even do it in the scribbly fashion that I'm doing this in. So once again, this is a little bit backwards the way that it's looking. I could cut this out and glue it on my page if I wanted to, but we're going to pretend like I actually drew this directly on top of the watercolor. So you're going to see I'm going to overlay that here in a second, and then I'm going to do some other somewhat crazy things to it here. So I have it here, and then I have put actual duct tape. It's virtual, but we can pretend, duct tape over where the mouth would go, and then I have splattered some black ink as well as using some nice compressed dark charcoal for some really just thick, aggressive marks across the page. All right, so for my other one that I'm making, I'm going to focus this one a little bit more on those leading lines that I talked about for scale and proportion and perspective, as well as that rule of thirds. So you'll see how if I'm dividing up my page, you can see the way that where I'm placing my subject matter here. So this is just a little drawing that I did. And you could use graphite or charcoal or some other kind of media that you can just sort of, smudge up a little bit, keep it really loose. So again, with things being a little backwards here, we're gonna pretend like I drew that directly on top of my watercolor background here. So now you can see what that looks like right on top of my watercolor. So now I'm using watercolor and charcoal, or maybe it's Conte, or whatever you want to use here. And so I'm adding on a few more little highlights here just because it looks a little bit different. So, but I wanted to make it really clear what I was drawing before adding in another, the other background and making it a little bit confusing. So look around the house, see what you have, and just have fun creating these compositions.